Good evening and welcome. My name is Elizabeth Ivory and I'm chair of NLC. I will begin by respectfully acknowledging that Northumberland County, where NLC is based, is located in the traditional and treaty territory of the Mississauga and Chippewa nations, collectively known as the Williams Treaties First Nations. We respectfully acknowledge that the Williams Treaties First Nations have been stewards and caretakers of these lands and waters, and that today remain vigilant over their health and integrity for generations to come. We are all treaty people. Tonight, in our third event in the Borders and Walls series, we're going to hear about how walls were the midwives of civilization. Our speaker, David Frye, joins us from Connecticut. David Frye is a professional historian and author whose views have been sought in interviews by the Science Channel, CNBC, National Geographic, the History Channel, BBC Radio, the Washington Post. I could go on, you get the idea. A specialist in late ancient history, David Frye received his PhD from Duke University and has participated in several international archaeological excavations. He's also a terrific writer, to which I can attest, having just read Walls, A History of Civilization in Brick and Blood. I'll quote from an online review. The man is erudite, clever, knowledgeable on the subject, and also opinionated and darkly humorous. What better credentials could NLC ask for? David, welcome to Northumberland County, virtually speaking. I will turn off my camera for your presentation and join you again after for questions. Audience, please be thinking of your questions and enter them in the Q&A function so that we can ask them when David is ready to talk about or to take questions from the audience. So now, David, please put your camera and your audio on and I'll turn mine off.
Okay, can everybody, okay, I actually can't ask if you can hear me, so I'm just going to assume that everyone can hear me now. And Elizabeth, if you need to indicate anything to me otherwise, please do so before I get too far along in the presentation. But certainly I want to thank you for inviting me, and I want to thank you for that kind introduction. You know, obviously tonight I'm not going to have time to do a some kind of full soup to nuts history of walls. So what I thought I could do is just touch on a few themes to give us something to think about. But first, I want to lay out a key distinction. We're going to be talking about two different types of walls tonight: city walls and border walls. Both played important roles in history, but of the two, city walls, I think, generally played the far greater role. For most of history, a city was a thing with walls, and that was true right up to the modern age, but it was especially true in antiquity. You know, if you go back to ancient Egypt, the hieroglyph for a city was, depicted a crossroads surrounded by a wall. If you go back to ancient China, the cities all had protective deities, and the term for those deities literally translated God of the wall and moat. So with rare exceptions, it was really impossible to imagine a city without walls. And I would argue, in fact, that it's nearly impossible to imagine the development of civilization without walls. So let me quickly try to share my screen with you. Let's see. No, that's not it. Okay. Right. And let me make that full screen. Okay. So hopefully you're all seeing a beautiful landscape, with some dry stone walls. And again, if someone could indicate to me somehow if that's not what you're looking at. But here you're looking at a set of walls, and I'm sure they probably look ancient. They aren't. These are from Inisheer, which is one of the Aran Islands off the western coast of Ireland. And on my first trip to Ireland, I had the good fortune of speaking with one of the individuals who actually helped construct these walls. They weren't constructed until the Great Depression. They didn't serve any particular purpose. They were never intended to serve any particular purpose. They didn't even mark property boundaries. They still don't. But men were out of work. They had lost their sense of purpose. So the government had created for them this boondoggle to gives them something to do, to enable them to feel like they were doing work, that they had some value. And this wasn't a new concept to the Irish. 100 years earlier, during the Great Famine, the Great Potato Famine, as it's sometimes called, Irish landowners did this. They paid starving peasants a penny a day to pick up stones and stack them into walls. Again, they served no purpose. And in some cases, they were just, they bordered on the absurd. And I want to show you a photograph of what I'm talking about here. In New England, where I live, we have stone walls that the only purpose of those stone walls was to get the rocks out of the field so that people could plow. Here is one of those penny walls from the Great Famine. And as you can see, it's stretching across a landscape in a region of Ireland called the Burren. And I don't know if any of you have ever been to the Burren, but there's almost no topsoil there. It's a place where the granite ledge just sort of comes to the surface of the soil everywhere. And I don't think you have to consider this landscape for long to realize that no one was ever going to be plowing one of these fields. There was really no point in trying to pick up any of the stones. So again, they were built so that for people that insisted on doing work for pay. And so our first question, the first theme I want to consider is, how did this happen? How do we come to live in a world in which people identify so much with their work that they feel they don't have any value if they're not working, and they identify by their occupations? Because I can assure you that wasn't always the way. So if you consider the world before walls, one of the key issues, and perhaps after walls and forever after, one of the key issues is security. You could argue that security is the foremost, most basic biological need. Every living creature has features to provide security. Even the cells in your body, even plant cells, have cell walls, cell membranes around them to give them security. And communities have always had to achieve security or risk annihilation. And we now know that that was certainly true in prehistory. So before walls, all of these communities pursued the same strategy to achieve security, and that was identifying every man as a warrior and training every man to be a warrior. It was a training that started young. From an early age, from the earliest possible age, boys endured painful desensitization exercises. These were designed to inure them to danger. Boys were shoved into bees' nests. They were beaten with sticks. They were chased around. They were poked at with spears. They were sent out into the night so that they wouldn't fear dark. They were made to wrestle naked so that they wouldn't ever, crave armor. Now, in a few places, these customs survive. And I thought I would talk about that just a little bit, just in terms of an illustration. So here we are in Kenya, and what we're seeing here are some Maasai warriors celebrating the circumcision of a 13-year-old. Now, I want us to think for a second about everything that this 13-year-old young man endured and why it happened. So we have accounts of, and it still happens. So, it's possible you could meet an individual that has gone through this. But in the months building up to the circumcision event, which is a rite of manhood, the family and the community members taunt the boy. They threaten him. They tell him, if you kick the knife, we'll come after you. If you kick the knife, we'll kill you. The boy is instructed that he cannot budge or even blink. The slightest movement during this ceremony, when he is being cut on and he's fully conscious, the slightest movement brands him as a coward. But if he doesn't move, he is considered a man. And he's considered one of the warriors worthy to, defend his family. Well, why on earth would you do that to a 13-year-old? I mean, you could certainly make the case that this is abuse. But they do it because they know that anyone who can endure all that pain and all that provocation without reacting at all, that individual can probably endure pretty much anything, and hopefully won't be fearful in battle, or so the reasoning goes. And that sort of reasoning was replicated across the globe. So here you're looking at a painting depicting what was called the Okipa ceremony, and it was practiced by the Mandan tribe of North America. Now, you may not be able to see clearly exactly what's happening here, and that's probably for the best. But if you have a big screen and you look closely, you can see that what's happened is they have used knives with serrated edges, and they have basically slots through the skin of these young men. And then they have inserted sticks into those slots, and they're hanging them by them. And they actually hang there for hours and hours while they're being ridiculed and poked at, being hung by their skin. And again, the theory is that, if you can handle that, you can handle anything. You're not going to, turn tail and let down, the rest of the men in battle. These sort of customs were common throughout, the world. Religion often played a role in the training of a warrior. Men were taught that death was not the end, that the soul would not die, or that it might be reincarnated, that they would feast in Valhalla. In some cultures, cowards were executed, smothered under the muck. And war was very much a part of the process of becoming a man. In ancient Germany, we're told that in one of these tribes, when the men were old enough to start growing a beard, they were forbidden to shave it. And they weren't allowed to shave for the first time until they'd finally killed another man in battle. And only then did they shave. They shaved over the victim, revealing to the victim for the first time their true face. So we're told that the young men of, for example, ancient Germany were frustrated by prolonged peace. And frankly, we see the same thing happening nearly 2,000 years later when we start learning about, young Native American braves. If a tribe went too long without battle, these young men would go off and find some other leader to follow that would take them into war, because battle was the only way they had of proving themselves. It was the only way they had of achieving prestige. It was the only way they had of proving themselves to the women and to the rest of the community. They needed war the same way that the peasants of Ireland needed work. Well, what we're looking for here is this point of transition where we go from societies where all the males are warriors to societies where the males have become workers. And that transition begins everywhere behind walls in walled cities. So let me move past that last slide because you're probably tired of looking at that, and show you a glimpse of the first city the earliest known city on Earth. I know this, you're probably looking at it and you think that doesn't look very much like a city, but I need you to use your archaeologist's imagination for a second. In particular, notice that there is part of a stone wall coming down here. And if you go all the way down here to a lower level, you can see where one of the early turrets, that was on one of the early walls was. So, these early cities, they had to be rebuilt and then rebuilt and rebuilt, right on top of each other. But this is the city of Jericho. It's not just the earliest known city, it's the earliest walled city, because what's the difference? There's no real distinction. Now, Jericho, and this is the Jericho that many of you may know from the Old Testament, if you have that in your background. Jericho is also the earliest center for agriculture anywhere. And let's think about agriculture for a second. Agriculture is, especially then, much more so than now, extremely labor intensive. Let's see, what's my next slide? So if you, for example, consider where we would say that the earliest true civilization developed in this area that I'm circling with my cursor, Sumer. I just want to talk about how they practiced agriculture there for a second, so that you understand, the need for laborers and the need for a commitment to work. So you can see here's the Persian Gulf. And so this is Mesopotamia between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, and that would be modern Iraq nowadays. And if you have a mind's eye image of Iraq, it is a very dry place. It's not in any way conducive to rainfall agriculture. And in fact, the only places where they could actually practice agriculture were sort of right where the rivers were dumping into the Persian Gulf. And the rivers would sort of break apart into really small channels. That's called anastomosing. And that allowed only very, very, very small scale farming. The only way they could scale up their farming and permit the growth of a larger population that could stay put in that one region would be to artificially recreate all those tiny natural channels. So every city required hundreds of miles of irrigation ditches. Now here you have just sort of a general plan of the irrigation ditches around one city, and you can see that you have to cut these major channels for the water, and then coming out from them almost like capillaries, coming out of your arteries and arterioles, you have these smaller irrigation ditches, and between them is where you could actually do your planting because you could move the water to the plants there. Obviously, this is an immense undertaking. As I said, each city would have had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of miles of ditches around it. And if that wasn't enough, you have to remember that this wasn't something that you could just do once and be done with. This was not permanent infrastructure. The river never stops. The river is always flowing. It's always dumping new layers of silt. And these irrigation ditches are going to silt right up in no time if they're left unattended, and weeds are going to start growing them in them and so forth. We have a letter to give you an idea of how much labor is required. We have a letter from the king of like a Syrian city named Mari, where he's complaining that he's got 2,000 men working on clearing out an irrigation channel, and it's not enough. 2,000 men, that was a hefty number of men given the tiny population of these cities back then. So you have to ask yourself, where did these workers come from? Certainly not from a community of warriors who felt that work was beneath them. But none of these great irrigation works were created, and none of these cities were really established on any level until generations after the construction of walls around the communities. Because the emergence of walls redefined the role of men. Walls enabled communities to achieve security without every man being a warrior. And I'll tell you, they were the most persistently effective tool in the history of warfare. They could be defended, walls could be defended by untrained men. Even old men, based on paintings on pots that I've seen, men who were unskilled in weapons, and they didn't even have to be brave. And by the way, did I say men? Because they didn't have to. In the Old Testament, we hear about the Philistine king Abimelech, who is killed when a woman shoves a grindstone off the edge of the wall and it falls and hits him on the head. So we don't need warriors anymore when we have walls. So the city dwellers, or the wall builders, however you want to put it, they learned to live without all those desensitization exercises. They stopped tormenting their boys. Pubertal circumcision becomes infant circumcision. No one, rejected the baby for crying during the ceremony. Men achieved respect in these communities without ever having scored their first kill. Women took husbands who had never fought in battle. Boys became men without enduring painful rites of manhood. This is when men have become workers rather than warriors. Now, this transformation, it came with regrets in Western civilization. And, from the start, the literature of Western civilization is replete with this idea that city life, that life behind the walls has made men softer, that the barbarians outside are stronger and more virtuous. You see that in the Gilgamesh epic, you see that in the Old Testament. Like I say, it's just a common motif in the literature. In ancient Greece, the Spartans went beyond talking about it and acted on that primitivist belief. The Spartans transformed their entire city into a grand experiment in primitivism. the Spartans believed that walls were for women. They wanted to go back to the old ways, a community of warriors defended by walls of men. But what did that mean? It meant that the Spartans didn't just repudiate walls, they repudiated everything that had developed behind walls. They repudiated all the so-called luxuries of civilizations, the things that they regarded as luxuries at any rate. They repudiate art. They repudiate, fine clothes, shoes, musical instruments. And in the meanwhile, they're bringing back the rights of manhood and, all the toughening and hardening exercises that the boys are going to be put through. But I think this primitivist ideal, which you most clearly see in Sparta, I think it raises another question, and maybe a second theme for us to consider. Were the Spartans right? Had walls, in fact, made men softer, more cowardly? It's actually not that hard to make the case for the Spartan point of view. For example, let's just look at the history of warfare. The emergence of walls everywhere precedes a dramatic shift in warfare. The soldiers of the walled cities don't go into battle naked, like the ancient Celts or some of these other barbarian peoples. No, they went into battle. They were the first to go into battle clad in armor, as much as they could afford, because armor made them feel safer. The armies of the walled cities marched in, I'm sorry, I skipped this slide, but that's also showing, it's an aerial view of some surviving, irrigation works from Mesopotamia. But, take a look at this one. And again, it's as art goes, it's not very good quality. So it's going to take you a second to understand what we're looking at here. But these are Sumerian soldiers going into battle. And you can already see that they're wearing headgear to protect themselves, that they're carrying these long rectangular shields. But look what else. They're going into battle very closely packed. Some of you, if you've had some history courses, may have heard of the Greek phalanx, which is a similar, sort of infantry unit. Why are you doing that? You're going into battle in closely packed order like this, so that the soldiers won't feel isolated, and so that they can draw courage from their numbers and frankly from the proximity of their buddies, and maybe even for the weaker soldiers to cower behind the stronger soldiers that have been put up there on the front lines. What else? On military campaigns, the soldiers of walled cities learned to build walls around the camps they slept in at night. And, for example, the Roman army did that on every single night of a march. So, their marching had to be done by noon so that they could start digging trenches and building, a wall around where they would sleep. But why do they do that? Again, because they don't want to sleep out in the open. They're not going to fall asleep if they're afraid that they could be, ambushed in the night. So, you can pile up examples like this and maybe make the case that, there's some truth to the Spartan point of view. And ultimately, I think probably the strongest piece of evidence for that is the absolutely consistent use by civilized kingdoms and empires of barbarian mercenaries, because they feel like, the barbarians who don't live in walled cities are better soldiers than them. All of that being said, there is another point of view. Thucydides, who is this very clear-thinking Greek historian from the 5th century BC. Thucydides, at one point, he says there's two different types of people in Greece. He said there are the communities where everybody still goes about armed, and there are the communities where the people have set aside their weapons and devoted themselves to other things. They have, learned to enjoy, luxuries and other pursuits. He might as well have said there are two types of Greeks: those that live inside walls and those that live outside walls. Now, Thucydides credits the Athenians with being the first people who stopped going about armed. And if you know anything about ancient Athens, you know it's very different from Sparta. That while the Spartans were living these deliberately culturally impoverished lives, that the Athenians were enjoying the arts. The Athenians were enjoying philosophy and math and history and all this other wonderful stuff that was developing in Athens. Because walls hadn't just freed up men to stack mud bricks and work in fields. As time goes on, walls have also freed up men to become philosophers, to become educators, to become artists, sculptors, painters, mathematicians, playwrights, actors. All those things now will develop in the world of the workers behind these walled cities. So it's Athens, not Sparta, which is the way of the future. And the spread of civilization is everywhere, the spread of walled cities. Now, I want to introduce you to somebody. This is Shulgi. And if you don't know what I'm saying, it's Shulgi, Shulgi. He was a king of the 3rd dynasty of Ur. It's in Sumer, and he would have lived around 2000 BC. He's one of the great kings of Sumerian history. But look what he's doing in this little statuette here. He's holding over his head a basket with a mud brick in it. He's working. So you're actually looking at, a king, a great king, and a very vain one, I might add, being depicted in his official propaganda doing work. So first of all, I want to point out what a change that is, that, work is no longer something that is relegated to the women and slaves, but it is something that is so respectable that, a king is willing to be depicted in this way. Secondly, there's another reason I want to mention Shulgi. Shulgi had the idea that, he wouldn't just wall the city of Ur, but that he would wall his entire kingdom. So Shulgi is responsible around 2000 BC for the world's first historically attested border wall. Now, I forgot I had that slide in there. So just, when I talk about mud bricks, this is what I'm talking about. So they're quite a bit different from the bricks that, you may have a brick house, the kind of bricks you're used to in your world. And I think that the fundamental difference in these bricks you're looking at here is you notice that they've not been baked. That if these had been baked, that straw wouldn't be sticking out, it would have been burned up. And, the difference between a baked brick and an unbaked brick is that, a baked brick has become a ceramic. so that it's eternal, more or less. It's never going to break down. It'll still be there when the sun stops spinning in the sky. An unbaked brick, you can wash that away with a good heavy rain because it'll just turn into mud. So, a lot of this work had to be redone periodically. But back to the border wall. So Shulgi obviously was not the last builder of a border wall. Here, again, use your archaeologist's imagination. If you don't see it, here's the individual that we're focusing on. It's Nebuchadnezzar. He's another figure that is well known from the Old Testament. Nebuchadnezzar famously built 3 massive walls around the city of Babylon. But subsequently, he decided even that wasn't enough. And so he built walls stretching all the way from the Tigris River to the Euphrates River, about 31 miles, to protect all of Babylonia, his kingdom, rather than just the city. And so this is something that we see in other places. I don't think it's necessarily an idea that spread, but that developed independently in other places. By 800 BC, we find a poem that attests to the earliest known border wall in China, built by an individual named Nan Cheng. And then 6 centuries after that, this handsome individual, and I've got to tell you that this is not from the 3rd century BC. This is a more modern depiction of the first emperor of China. So maybe this isn't exactly what he looked like. But at the very beginning of the Empire of China, the first emperor constructed an enormous border wall, which is known in Chinese history as the Long Wall. And I mean long. We actually don't know the exact length of it, so there are estimates that range from between 1,000 miles and 6,000 miles. So frankly, putting to shame anything we have ever seen before anywhere on Earth or, in Mesopotamia. And this is how the Chinese workers did that, if you can imagine. So they're not making the mud bricks. What they would do is create these wooden frames. And then you can see this individual with the shovel, he's tossing this wind-blown soil into in between the frames. And then this individual is tamping down the soil. So, it's very, very compacted, and then they're able to remove the wooden frame after that. This is a lot of work. Imagine 6,000 miles of this. This was too much work, frankly, even for a world of workers. And so, Chinese peasants remembered the horrors of having to build this wall and sang about the horrors of building the wall and told folk stories about the horrors of building the wall. They used to say that, the folk stories were that if a worker was ever even caught napping, that he would be buried inside it. They sang folk songs saying, if your son is born by the wall, don't raise him. So, that's how much they hated the amount of work they had to do to create this. Okay, so this is Rome's Great Wall builder, and his name is Hadrian. And I know that I have a lot of well-read individuals listening to me tonight, so I imagine that many of you have heard of Hadrian's Wall, and perhaps a few of you have seen it. Not quite there yet. Hadrian built hundreds of miles of walls and various locations around the Roman Empire in the 2nd century AD. Here we're looking at one of the walls he constructed in Tunisia, or what's left of it. He also constructed, hundreds of miles of palisades and dirt mounds in Germany. And then his most famous wall was in northern England, and that's the one that we know nowadays as Hadrian's Wall. And there are stretches of it like this that are just absolutely beautiful. So, if you still have good legs and your feet can handle it and you have a chance to go up there, it's really nice to hike along the remains of the wall. It looks more or less like a farmer's wall now, but it was much higher back in the day before it was raided in the Middle Ages by local farmers to, build barns and farmhouses and so forth out of. So look, I've now been showing you hundreds of miles, thousands of miles of border walls. And, I guess one of the questions, another theme we might raise is, were these border walls worth it? Did they accomplish anything? And I guess, it's one of those things that depends on who you ask. About a generation after Hadrian, there was a Greek orator who delivered a speech to the Roman emperor at that time, whose name was Antoninus Pius. The orator's name was Aelius Aristides. And he delivers an account of the Roman Empire at that time to the emperor. And it's interesting what he says, because in Aristides' mind, these walls that had been built a generation earlier, they worked. He said that Rome the entire empire was enjoying unprecedented prosperity because of those walls. He said the walls had brought peace for all. The Romans, he said, enjoyed complete security, that no one in the empire went about with weapons. They had no need for them, that they had not experienced war, that they didn't even believe in the concept of war. And I don't mean that philosophically, but he says that the Romans believed that the old stories of wars were just fairy tales. They couldn't believe that things like that had ever happened. He says the reason for that are these walls, which he described as impregnable, surrounding the empire like an armed camp, guarded by soldiers with ranks so thick that an arrow couldn't pass through them. Now, let's see. Okay, yeah, I've got time. I just wanted to check my watch for a second. Not everyone saw it that way. And I've got to tell you, certainly the walls became much less effective about roughly 50 years after they were built, when a pandemic hit Rome and largely wiped out the frontier troops in the later 2nd century. And after that, the frontiers were, much more porous and much more contested. And after a couple of centuries have passed, we get a very different account by this two-fisted philosopher named Synesius, who was very much an admirer of the ancient Spartans, and in fact, like to imagine that he was descended of the ancient Spartans. And his point of view couldn't have been more different from that of Aelius Aristides. He felt that behind walls and so forth, that the Romans had become soft, that they were relying on barbarians to fight their battles for them, and that the only real men left in places like Constantinople and Rome were the barbarians, and this wouldn't end well for the Romans. So again, it goes back to that question of what was the effect of living behind walls, and it seems as if there were multiple effects of living behind those walls. Okay, just very quickly, as long as I'm talking about border walls, I thought this would be a fun one to show you. Again, use your imagination. I know you don't see much of a wall here, but if you can follow my cursor, you can see that there is a mound and now covered with grass kind of stretching off this way. That mound was actually much higher back in the day. It would have had a wooden palisade on top of it, extending its height by, another 12 feet or so, and it stretched 600 miles. And I'd like to ask you if I could hear your voices, if you could figure out where it's from, but I'm just going to tell you that the 600-mile wall, known nowadays as the Dragon Walls, defended Ukraine. So yeah, that country has been a battlefield for a very long time. Okay, so let me just finish up quickly here. Obviously, the age of walls can't last forever. And I think more than anything else, it was gunpowder, which made sure of that. And, there's one particular moment, which I sort of regard as the beginning of the end of walls, and certainly symbolic of the coming end of walls. And that was the fall of Constantinople in 1453. Constantinople had a tremendous set of city walls around it that had been constructed way back in the 5th century at the time of the Emperor Theodosius II. Those walls had defended the city for 1,000 years when the Turks finally brought it down. And what enabled the Turks to bring it down, I want to say cannons, but the reality is really one cannon in particular, a monster of a cannon. And this is a duplicate that was made of it, like a year later. But it was so large, like if you look, see where my cursor is circling here? Imagine you're standing there reading that placard, and that gives you an idea. This is how big a human is, right? And this is how big this one particular cannon is. This cannon fired stone balls that were 7 feet in diameter. And no, I'm sorry, 7 feet in circumference. I guess there's a pretty big difference. And could fire them over a mile. And that's what finally brought down the walls of Constantinople. Certainly there was a long denouement in the history of walls, where the wall builders became more and more clever to try to overcome the also increasing cleverness of the artillery manufacturers. But in the long run, walls built for this kind of purpose certainly came to an end in largely in the early modern period. Okay, so as I understand it, I need to switch us over. Let me stop the screen sharing for a second and allow Elizabeth to step back in. If I haven't put Elizabeth to sleep. There she is.
Oh,
okay,
I'm here,
hey Elizabeth.
I'm here. Yep.
Okay.
That was fascinating. We have the question and answer function open. So if you have questions, please submit them. I'll start off with one. I can't be the only person who learned that, or at least I thought it was right, that agriculture is what allowed people to have leisure time. And it's fascinating and surprising that you say it was really the walls that came first. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that was one of the things that I found stunning. I always assumed it would, until I was really digging into this research in the early time period. I really thought that agriculture would have had to come first too, and certainly on a very small scale, agriculture would have preceded a lot of this. But if you look at the places where civilization developed, you required a lot of cooperation. Like, this was not a land where an individual could have, sort of his own farm. They had to work together in large groups to build these irrigation works and so forth. And it's just the timing of it more than anything else that struck me, that they didn't develop these large communities through irrigation agriculture and then like, oh, okay, we're going to protect our community with walls. It was quite the opposite. They had walls generations before they started, practicing that cooperative irrigation agriculture. And so it really seems to have been something that, enabled it to happen. You had to have the men have that commitment to work, and that's something that you don't find when you read the accounts. Even in more modern times, like, sort of accounts where the Europeans are first encountering Native Americans, and they're marrying into these tribes and living with them and so forth, and writing about them and so forth. And in many cases, they're appalled that the men don't ever seem to work, that the women literally do 100% of the work, and the men are like smoking pipes and talking about battles all the time and so forth. And this was an astonishingly universal thing, so anyway, I think it was the timing more than anything else that struck me, that the walls had to precede the irrigation. Everywhere you go, as agriculture is spreading, you will always find these agricultural communities, even before it's like true walls. They're surrounded by palisades, ditches, and the like.
Well, you mentioned the colonists arriving in North America and being astounded at the men sitting around doing nothing. Were there walls in North America?
No. Well, okay. No, hang on. I'm talking about sort of North America, but in Central America, surely, yes, yeah, absolutely. And that wasn't actually well understood. I mean, a lot of the stuff I wrote, I maybe couldn't have written 20 years ago, or even in some cases 10 years ago. It's stuff like the use of ground penetrating LIDAR, which has enabled scholars to learn that, there were, in fact, walls around some of these very early, like Olmec communities and Mayan communities and so forth. Previously, we weren't aware they were ever there. And so yeah, in the areas, like in Central America and so forth, or in the Andes, where, you see cities developing and writing and all this kind of stuff, mathematics and all that, absolutely, you'll find wall builders. Now, in North America, by and large, like where Canada is now, and where the United States is now, by and large, you're not finding, that type of civilization. You're not finding cities and, literature or anything like that. And you're still in a similar situation to like the ancient Germans or the ancient Celts, or, the Huns or something.
So one of the questions that's come in is very specific, and it goes back to your discussion around the earliest walls that were formed to protect, or at least to provide a place to grow things. How tall and wide, what were the dimensions of these small walls?
Oh my gosh. So they're not actually, first of all, they're not actually constructing the walls around the fields. Okay, so the walls themselves were just around the city, and the fields would have been outside the city. And when they were under attack, they actually had to flee their own fields and come behind the city walls. And, that could cause a problem if they didn't have enough food stored. Now, the dimensions of the walls, the reason I said, oh my gosh, is we're talking, I said these were a lot of work. That picture of the mud bricks stacked up that I showed you, you could have pushed that over with your hand, right? It wouldn't have been a very effective deterrent. So with mud bricks, and this is a place without a lot of trees, starting in, say, Mesopotamia. So, you're not typically able to bake all the bricks, and that would certainly make them a lot harder. The only way you can make these walls effective is to make them immensely thick. So, and the same in China, where they're using a different technique. We're talking about city walls that could be, for example, 80 feet thick at the base. So that's why I'm saying, hoo boy, they're big. It's a lot of labor. And of course, they actually have to be high. Also, the height would have varied, from one city to another, but certainly high enough that you couldn't just jump right up, on them.
Okay, okay with you if we skip around a bit. We just got a question about the Great Wall of China. The person wants to know how successful and for how long was the Great Wall of China used as a defense?
So, so they know a little bit, about walls in China. So the wall I was telling you about, for example, the so-called Long Wall of the first emperor, that was the first one, and that's not actually the Great Wall of China. 6,000 miles long, and it's not the Great Wall of China. There was a subsequent wall, built the next century, where it was extended to a great extent by the early Han emperors, and that wasn't the Great Wall of China either. So the wall that we consider the Great Wall of China today, and the one that you can go visit so easily as a tourist, that wall is more or less modern. It wasn't even, they didn't even start the construction on that until the 15th century, AD. So it's a much later wall. So first of all, I wanted to get that clear. Now, in general, it is sometimes very hard to answer these questions about how effective these walls were, because it depends on your time period. Not the time period that we're talking about, but the duration. Like, is it enough that a wall was successful for 20 years, or is it a failure if it didn't hold off the invaders for 1,000 years or forever? So for example, I talked about Hadrian's Wall in the talk, and Hadrian's walls, frankly, and they do seem to have been by and large successful for the first couple of generations. And then when they didn't have enough guards, they stopped, being very successful at all. Same thing is the case with China. China will go through periods of the wall being successfully defended, and it will go periods in which the guards of the wall will turn on the Chinese, let the invaders in, and so time and time again, China will be overrun by the barbarians. But I will say this, the key to any wall successfully doing its job, and then I'm talking about these walls that were intended for security purposes, for the military, although I suppose you could apply it to, you could certainly apply it to modern walls as well, is that they also have to be guarded. I mean, an unguarded wall is really not going to stop any army for long. I mean, humans have a certain amount of ingenuity for how to get around and over things. So we can find examples of a poorly guarded wall failing, but at the same time, the last time that the Great Wall of China was pressed into military service was the 1930s, when the Japanese were invading Manchuria, and the Japanese were armed with tanks, airplanes, machine guns, and artillery. The Chinese army was frankly much more poorly equipped, but it used the wall, and at the wall actually successfully held off the Japanese for a month before the Japanese finally punched through. So it's surprising, even in the age of artillery and modern weaponry, how effective a wall could be, if it was well defended. But again, I don't think there's one easy answer to that question of how effective the Great Wall was.
Can we jump ahead a little bit? I know we only have a few minutes left, maybe for a few more questions, but and I know that you were speaking about the concept of walls being the midwife of civilization. So we're dealing with antiquity, but can you provide us with your perspective on how modern walls, like gated communities, not military ones, but things like that, are analogous to the walls that were first built?
Yeah, I mean, it all comes down to the same thing. I mean, people have this this need for security, and I think this ties into other themes as well. People who, for example, may not feel that there is a need for a great big border wall around their nation may simultaneously feel that they need a micro wall around their own home, or a gate going into their neighborhood, or, my gosh, the tens of billions and probably over $100 billion, dollars now being spent on home security. It's a huge thing in this country, and I imagine in Canada as well. And by the way, these things are not just happening in the United States, that, you get the gated communities and so forth. On the other side of the United States, Mexico, and even all the way down in South America, you find a lot more of what I call micro walls than you do up here. So they're actually, I've had a few cases where people kind of misread what I was saying in the book, and they thought that I was in some way characterizing anybody that was on the other side of a border wall as a barbarian, as if like Mexicans are barbarians and so forth. That's not true at all. The Mexicans and the South Americans, they're all descendants culturally of wall builders, just like Canadians and Americans are. So I guess, to tie this back into one of our themes, why do we feel so insecure? That we keep having to, if we can't have a big wall protecting us, then we need small local walls protecting us and micro walls protecting us and so forth. And I think there's a lot of people that would argue that is, sort of the disease of civilization. This is an idea that's been floating around for a long time. Even people like Freud wrote about the civilization and its discontents, and it always feels like, when you read the news, that anxiety levels are on the rise everywhere, and I certainly wouldn't want to go back to a world of 13-year-olds getting circumcised. But at the same time, you can see the Spartan point of view, that maybe we have become, with the softer, easier upbringings that we have, the fact that we're sheltered from so much stress and insecurity, that we have become more prone to anxiety. And I think that's something that would probably resonate with psychologists, because they say that one of the key ways to get over fears is to desensitize, just really have to get out there, and that's something that's not a natural part of our society anymore. So I don't know, but certainly I would say micro walls are not going away anytime soon.
In fact, you say in your book, and you mentioned in the beginning, that we are now in the new age of walls, and I think since the Berlin Wall fell, 70 more have risen around the world. And what do you think this says about our efforts at globalization? Was that a fleeting fool's dream? Are we going back to where we started?
Okay, now you're getting globalization. Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I necessarily tie the issues of walls with, into this broader issue of globalization, because with or without walls, maybe the trade, is still going on. So I might pass on that question.
Okay, fine.
If that's okay, I'm going to take a pass.
Of course. And I'm going to ask one last question from one of our audience members. On a price performance basis, what was the most successful, significant wall in history in achieving its purpose?
Oh, wow. Okay. So I'm going to take the easy answer and probably say the walls of Constantinople, partly because, if you look at the design, I wish I had a map that I could quickly call up here, but I don't actually have one in my Zoom. But if you look at the design of what would become the Byzantine Empire, the old Eastern Roman Empire, you have Constantinople, the capital city, sort of at a little bottleneck. And then there's the European part of the Byzantine Empire to the north of it, and the Asian part of the Byzantine Empire to the south of it. And, for an invader to come up from the south, they could take Asia Minor, but to get the rest of it, they had to get through Constantinople. Or for an invader maybe coming from the steppes from the north, they could come down and maybe they could take the European part, but to get to the Asian part, they had to come through Constantinople. And so that one city, it wasn't a wall around the entire empire, but it was at this bottleneck. And those walls were time and time again held off invaders, and at times very large invading forces. So I don't think I would be the first person to answer it that way, but I would say the walls of Constantinople.
Okay, thank you. One last question. Why do people use the term or the axiom build bridges, not walls, incorrectly?
Okay, so you did read my book, Elizabeth, and I know you read the book all the way to the end now. That's not the last thing I talk about, but it's in the last chapter, I think, where I bring that up. Yeah, so there's a little paragraph in there where I take issue with the phrase build bridges, not walls. And honestly, my issue with that is that historically, bridges and roads are built for armies. And you build bridges to someplace so that you can invade that place. I mean, that's why Caesar built a bridge across the Rhine River. That's why Trajan built a bridge across the Danube. That's why the Ukrainians are trying to blow up bridges across rivers now so that the Russians can't use them. So bridges and roads are tools of war. Whereas oddly enough, walls were intended to be tools of peace. Walls were intended to, make war not happen so that people will be safe behind them. So I'm just saying that, if you're at all a military historian, that you hear that phrase and you think that doesn't make any sense. I get what people were trying to say, like we should all hold hands, but maybe they should just say we should all hold hands instead of build bridges.
Okay, well, thank you, David. This has been really fascinating, and I can't recommend the book highly enough. I did read the whole thing, and I think everyone would really enjoy it. You're a terrific writer, and it's a page turner. And for nonfiction, that I think that's a compliment. And well, I shouldn't say that. Lots of fantastic nonfiction are page turners, but yours definitely is. So if you just bear with me for a minute, I just have to do some housekeeping, and then we'll sign off. Okay, so that wraps up our presentation for tonight, but the Borders and Walls series continues. This Saturday, John Shaw Remington will be leading a tour of local dry stone walls in Northumberland County. There's still a few tickets left, so if you're interested in that, go to the website. Next Thursday and Friday, Norm Ravin of Concordia University will present on the topic of anti-Semitism as a metaphorical wall. The following week will feature renowned art historian Warren Carter on muralism and contemporary street art. These are all live events, and tickets are available online. So we've got a couple of great events coming up, and we hope you stay with us. Please take a moment to complete the very short survey when I sign off, and it will pop up on your screen. So thank you so much, David, for sharing your expertise with us. Really appreciate all of your interesting points, and the slides were fascinating. Maybe you could share those with us so I can let our audience have a copy. That'd be great.
Sure, absolutely. Great. Yeah.
Okay. So thank you everyone for attending tonight, and we'll see you again soon.
All right, thank you.